There we go. All right, we're going to talk a little bit about foliar diseases and their control today. It's a fairly appropriate topic because it's raining this year. That's something I hadn't done in a few years. And when it rains, we get diseases. So how do we get the page down?
Just there's a slight delay, but a click your mouse will be your best bet.
There you go. All right. Typically, these are the 4 foliar diseases that we run into on corn in Alabama. Their importance varies greatly. As I mentioned before, if we have a dry spring and early summer, none of them are really going to be an issue, even in irrigated corn. We do need the real driver of all foliar diseases is frequent showers, and so you got to have them or nothing really happens. But we see southern corn leaf blight, which has shown up already. Northern corn leaf blight, seen a little bit of it. Diagnosed gray leaf spot in central Alabama over at plant breeding unit yesterday. So it's shown up. Normally, gray leaf spot, in my experience, has been an issue more in northern Alabama than it has been in South Alabama. I was actually kind of surprised to see it at the plant breeding unit. I have not had a chance to get in North Alabama to see if there are any issues up in that area. But since they're getting a lot of rain, more than likely that disease may be an issue there. And then, of course, the last one that really has potential to cause devastating damage to corn is southern rust. And rust is a disease that probably, as I said, it should be feared more than any of the other ones. In some of the fungicide trials we run at Gulf Coast Substation in years past, the yield gains from fungicide inputs have been up to 80 bushels per acre. And at Bruton, we've gotten 65 bushel per acre yield gains out of 2 fungicide applications. So that gives you an indication as to what impact this disease might have on corn. The symptoms are similar to common rust, and I'll show common rust in a moment. We have seen a fair amount of common rust this year. It's more of a cooler weather rust disease in corn, whereas southern rust is more of a hotter weather rust disease. But southern rust shows up. You usually get most of the pustules on the upper leaf surface. They're clustered, whereas common rust tends to be a little more diffuse as far as the spacing of the rust pustules. The other thing is the southern rust pustules will also appear on the leaf sheaths. It'll appear on the husks of the ears. It basically, any green part of the plant can be infected by the southern rust fungus. And MHC kind of gives you an indication as to what the level of damage you'll see in maturing corn, whereas it basically starts to fire up early. And you get up close to it, and the pustules are very easy to see. But by that point, you're pretty well toast. Southern corn leaf blight has made a reappearance this year. Normally, I see a little bit of it in the lower canopy, and it doesn't really seem to be doing anything to the plants. But this year, with all the rain that we've had, I've seen more southern corn leaf blight that I really have seen in a few years. Down at Gulf Coast in image A, showing the lesion formation down in the lower canopy. It's maybe moved up 3 or 4 leaves within the canopy in this particular spot. B shows some of the lesions that have kind of dried out a little bit. They have a tan center with kind of a light brown margin around them. There may be some zoning within the lesion itself, not kind of like target spot, but you do have some light dark banding within the lesion. And C is a close-up showing, again, some of the banding as well as what we call water soaking around the edge of the lesion. Normally don't see this too much with fungal diseases, but I think because of all the moisture in the atmosphere, the frequent showers, we're just getting very rapid lesion expansion. And so we're seeing symptoms on these plants that normally we would not see, because lesion expansion would be limited by canopy drying out. And then D is just, again, another image showing severe damage on a leaf with some, probably some fly larvae on there as well. Image A and B are common rust. The one thing about common rust, if you look at it, as I said, the pustules are more diffuse or more spread out on the leaf. The spore masses tend to be more of a brown or cinnamon brown color, whereas southern rust tends to be more distinctly orange. Although for me, going out there and looking at when there's low levels of disease, it's really hard for me to tell them apart without looking on a microscope, and even then there are some problems. I would have thought B was southern rust in just looking at it, but it turned out to be common rust. And then image C is just some of the northern corn leaf blight that has shown up this year. Again, the lesions have a little bit different look to them as far as zoning and coloring because of the high moisture levels out there. These lesions may only be an inch or two in length, but on some varieties, the more sensitive varieties, they may be 12 to 15 inches in length, and a single lesion will basically destroy an entire leaf. But we're not seeing too much of that at this point in time. So, as I said before, southern rust is the disease I'm most concerned about, and it has shown up in southwest or south central, southwest Georgia within the past week and a half. And it was diagnosed down at the Gulf Coast substation a week ago. And but I have not found it in Bruton. I did not find it at Headland when I looked, nor did I find it at in central Alabama at either of the two lake locations that I looked. So at least until this point in time, it has not spread particularly far, but given the weather patterns, it still can develop very rapidly once it becomes or moves into another area. You know, down in South Alabama, particularly Southwest Alabama, where they're getting a tremendous amount of rain, and you're more likely to see a lot of rust pressure. If the fields have a high yield potential, they probably need to be treated at least once with a fungicide, maybe twice, depending on what type of disease development occurs in the field. You know, in central and north Alabama, I would tend to be more in a mode of having or suggesting to the growers that they actually scout the fields to see whether or not they have any disease activity out there. If they don't, you know, maybe they might want to wait a little bit, check again in another week or so, and to determine whether they need treatments. In the field trials that we've run as fungicide screening trials, one of the things that has shown up is that if you put a fungicide on and there's no disease pressure, you're not going to gain anything from the fungicide treatment. The only time that you see any return as far as increased yields from fungicides is when we have a lot of damage to the ear and the ear -1 leaf. And I already mentioned earlier the driver for southern rust and even these other diseases is the weather patterns. We are in a very wet weather pattern. The forecast calls for rainfall through the next 9 to 10 days. So it looks like these showers, you may not get a shower every day, but if you get one every couple of days, that's enough to keep the ball rolling. More than likely, the really early corn, as it normally does, will escape damage from southern rust. But if it was planted a little bit later, maybe late March, certainly you get into April, and again, the further south you are, the higher the risk. That's where you might see some real issues with southern rust and possibly some of these other diseases. But definitely, the later you plant, the more likely you are to have issues with southern rust, and possibly some of them something like northern and southern corn leaf blight. You know, at this point in time, we're really talking about fungicide use. For all intents and purposes, there are no resistant varieties for rust anyway. The reaction of other varieties to the other diseases I mentioned, it's kind of hard to tell. We basically have to go on company literature. So at this point in time, we're basically down to fungicide inputs as a means of controlling any of these diseases that are going to be an issue. And this is a fairly but not entirely complete list of the products that are on the market. Generally speaking, they all have activity against rust, northern, southern corn leaf blight, and gray leaf spot. The one I mentioned that doesn't have rust on the label is Quadris or Custodia, which is a generic azoxystrobin, but it actually does have activity against this disease. But those would not be my first choice for use on corn in this area for rust control. And the newest product, it's now a formulated multi-active ingredient product. It was a twin pack last year, is Tiva Pro, and we've done a little bit of work with Tiva Pro, but don't have a lot of data on the performance. But given the products that are in it, I expect that it will be highly effective in controlling any of these diseases in corn. Another new product is Ophions. It came on the market last year. Basically, the way the rate is set up, it's a one spray program. Again, we're probably in this area we're at VT probably in most fields or in the late vegetative stages. So we would probably be, if an application was going to be made, somewhere around VT or R1. And the Tiva Pro I've already mentioned. The application timing is kind of up in the air. I know that a lot of products mentioned early season sprays, which were way past at B4 to B6. When I've done these trials, I've never really seen any benefits from those early season applications. So I like to keep the fungicides available for late season use, where we're more likely to see considerable amount of disease development. So we're looking at anywhere around VT to start scouting, around V12 to VT stage, and then scout weekly. You can make an application at the first sign of disease and repeat again up to soft dough. Normally, with corn, soft dough is as late as the fungicides have any particular labeling. Plus the fact it seems like applications made in field trials after soft dough don't have any effect on yield. So we're only looking at about a 2 or 3 week period of time when we're going to be making fungicide applications to corn. The other option, and this would be maybe more in South Alabama, would be just a calendar or growth stage schedule 2 application program where you're looking at 1 application at BT to R1 and then again 14 days later. And that would particularly be useful in situations where rust really is a threat and needs to be controlled, because one spray programs are just not going to check southern rust. I run a trial. This is on really late planted corn, probably late May or early June planted corn down at Bruton. Most of the time, as I mentioned earlier, the later you plant, the more likely you are to have severe rust damage in corn. And particularly in 2014 and 15, that was certainly true. In 2016, we had very little southern rust, primarily because of the relatively drier weather patterns late last summer, and we just didn't have a lot of rust damage. There are considerable differences in the performance of fungicides against southern rust. And the products listed here on the Quilt XL probably did the most consistent job in controlling southern rust in corn, followed by the 4-ounce rate of Paraxor. They did a really nice job consistently over the 3-year study period. Some other products like Stratego and Vortex in particular did not perform well, even applied twice in 2014 under really severe rust pressure, but under moderate to lighter rust pressure, they did a good job, and we'll look at the yields and yielded fairly well. Approach Prima did fairly well, kind of in between the quilt and the Paraxor and the other products. The two materials that really don't work very well is Tilt and the generic tebuconazole. I saw some in some other listing, somebody mentioned using generic tebuconazole on corn for rust control. And when you look at the level of control as well as the yield response that you might get from these products, the generics are basically a waste of time. We're really looking at using the brand name products on corn to really obtain a high level of control.
Excuse me, that scale, can we go back to that?
Can we go? Yeah.
Is that a scale of like 1 to 10?
Yeah, it's a 1 to 10 scale.
1 to 10 scale, so,
Mhm.
10
So
is the most.
10 is the most. 10 is a dead plant.
Gotcha.
At rating. So this is probably 70 to 80% of the canopy at the rating date. For example, at untreated control is totally blighted at that point in time. Whereas, you know, 1 is there's not a pustule on the plant.
Okay, thanks.
And these are the yields for these 3 years over the study period. And as I mentioned before, you definitely see a relationship between a high level of rust control and higher yields, with Quilt XL coming out really numerically and generally statistically with higher yields than most of the other products that we screened. The Paraxor did well and really well in 2 of 3 years, didn't do quite as well in 2015. There are several products like Vortex, Approach Prima, that did really well in at least 1 or maybe 2 years of the 3-year study. And then you compare that with the two generic products, and statistically, the yields obtained with those 2 treatments were similar to the non-fungicide treated control. So they just, and the differences in yield response among the fungicides is quite large, particularly under severe rust pressure. So if we're looking at efficiently managing southern rust in corn, the name brand products are definitely the way to go, because you tend to get a much larger yield gain, and there are some differences in performance among the products that we've screened to date. So keep that in mind. So that's based. This is just an image from 2015 showing the differences in the appearance of the plants, and you can see the control is basically blighted. The plants are burning up from the bottom. You can see the rust damage in the muscle in the tilt treated corn, and then the Quilt XL corn is bright green. And that's just an indication as to how effective that product is in controlling rust. And as I said before, we certainly have seen higher yields with that material than we have with either Tilt or the generic tebuconazole muscle. So if there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer them, and we'll see how this year turns out.
Any ideas on, I know the southern rust resistance broke down a few years ago, how soon we're going to have some resistant varieties?
You know, I don't know what Pioneer and DeKalb might be doing. One of the now retired pathologist at Pioneer mentioned several years ago that what happened was they lost their host differentials, corn inbreds, for determining rust races. So I guess those inbreds are no longer available. So at this point in time, nobody knows what's out there. So and so effectively, there is no program for developing southern rust resistance in corn. So it's a mess.
So
we're stuck.
Keep track of those fungicides.
Yeah, plant early and hope for the best.